Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to City University. My name is Miguel Mera. I am the Head of Department of Music. And tonight we're hosting the third of our debates that have happened during our City Summer Sounds Festival. The two other debates were Are We All Ethnomusicologists Now? And a discussion about gender and music technology. And there may even be some resonances, particularly with that second debate, with this one today. I'm going to introduce each of the panellists just before they speak, but just for now, so that you can put some names to faces. We have Pamela Bernard, Deborah Annetts, Derek Bell and Nico MacDonald. I should also say that we invited numerous politicians to speak at this event. In fact, pretty much anyone who'd ever uttered a word on this subject, the topic of our discussion, and unfortunately none were available. That's not with particular value judgment. Many did say that they would like to have been here and they sent their apologies and so on. So the title of this debate is Full Steam Ahead. There's been a very active promotion of STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths, but would the addition of arts to this core be desirable, and where does music fit into that debate? The impetus for this discussion comes from the government-sponsored Your Life campaign and some of the issues that came out of that. At the campaign launch in November 2014, the Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, sought to promote uptake in STEM subjects at school and college with the ultimate aim of increasing the number of students taking A-levels in maths and physics by more than 50% over the ensuing 3 years. That campaign seemed to follow figures put forward by the Edge Foundation, and their mission statement is to champion technical, practical and vocational learning. And they suggested there'd been a large increase in the number of students taking degrees in humanities, business and creative arts or design between 2002 and 2012, and a much smaller increase in students taking physical sciences, engineering and technology degrees. And we can talk about that perhaps later. I want to read some of Nicky Morgan's statement from that presentation, because I think it's germane to what we're talking about today. So she said, only a decade ago pupils were being told to take the maths and the sciences only if they wanted a specific skilled career such as a doctor, pharmacist or engineer. She then said, if you didn't know what you wanted to do, then the arts and the humanities were what you chose because they were useful, we were told, for all kinds of jobs. We now know that this couldn't be further from the truth, that the subjects to keep young people's options open are STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths, because the skills gained from studying these subjects will come in useful in almost any job you care to mention, from the creative and beauty industries to architecture. So our questions today: how accurate are these claims? Does that position reflect a downgrading of creativity, or is it simply a necessary economic refocus for future sustainability? Would the addition of arts to the STEM core and making STEAM be desirable? Our first speaker is Pamela Bernard. She holds degrees in music performance, music education and philosophy, and she's Professor of Arts, Creativities and Education at the University of Cambridge. Her primary interest is creativities research, for which she is internationally recognised. She's the author, co-author, editor of 9 books, 21 reports, 36 articles in refereed journals, and many, many more things. She's also convener of the Commonwealth Creativities and Intercultural Arts Network, co-convener of the British Education Research Association Creativity Special Interest Group, and a past co-editor of the British Journal of Music Education. She serves on numerous other editorial boards. Pam.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invite tonight. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to disclose my beliefs. I have 3 that I'm going to disclose, and then I'm going to work through some a project that will bring about some problematizing around the themes tonight. And I will stop at 10 minutes, although I could go on for an hour, but I won't. I'll stop at 10 and actually hopefully provoke you to be thinking of questions later. One belief, and something that I stand for, something that I practice, and that we see in the research, is that transdisciplinarity is featured in the career creativities of successful musicians. We have research that backs that claim up. We also have research to back up the symbiosis of arts and sciences. But there are challenges in the realm of putting these ideas forward. Thirdly, digital making communities infuse the arts within STEM fields. Again, not always an idea that is accepted by all. I run a biennial conference called Building Interdisciplinary Bridges Across Cultures. That's BIBAC, BBAC. And if you look up bbac.org, you'll see this conference. It's at the end of July. And there's 90 papers, most of which are STEAM, or a STEM subject infused with arts, bringing together communities. Very excited and very committed and passionate communities. I'm involved in a research commission that's being funded by the British Educational Research Association, BERA, and this commission's focus is exploring the educational potential and challenges arising at the educational interface of science, technology, engineering and mathematics subjects, STEM subjects, and the arts, STEAM. So we're looking at STEM to STEAM and looking at creative pedagogies that are either being practiced or being researched or being theorised, looking at a literature review. We have 4 meetings. One was in Cambridge, and I'll give you some of the findings from that meeting of 30 people coming and discussing their practices, the theories, and some of the conundrums, a lot of conundrums around the idea of STEAM and STEM. We live in a profoundly fast-moving and changing world. We live in a world which has the word education as a contested concept. If education is contested, then of course it's no surprise that historically the whole area of the interface of subjects forming STEM is also contested. We have an academic group in Cambridge at the Faculty of Education called STEM. And they are, I better say, they're wonderful people. They actually are the most disparate group of people and subject areas, and there is no practice of STEM in terms of anything that's integrated. It is, of course, subjects remain in silos. And so with this idea, here is an emerging question that a conundrum that we've been working with as this commission works together for a year. How do the sciences and the arts contribute to such diversified learning opportunities that are required for 21st century learners? What do 21st century learners need? And ultimately, the question is the proposition of what is a STEAM pedagogy, or what is a STEM pedagogy? And what do the arts offer in terms of a potential for something that's more humanistic, a humanistic form of education, and a more relevant form of education? There are lots of tensions that exist between conservative and potentially transformative educational practices. All you have to do is talk to scientists, physicists, chemists, biologists in a secondary a school setting to see the silos that operate within a subject area itself. So here are 3 key questions around real-world understanding. How do children, young people and adults understand STEM, let alone STEAM, in everyday life? When do they do STEAM? They do it. When does that doing stop? I think we know the reason why, but just thinking of your own experience as children, or if you have children, what kind of play goes on in the playground, in the classroom, in their houses and in their lives that you can recognise as being STEAM? What does that look like? Let's look at the social justice question. What are the pressure points for a STEAM agenda that address the disadvantaged? Thinking of race, thinking of disability and what is the relationship between globalizing concerns like environmental change and sustainability. What if we were to teach STEAM or STEM? How might sustainability and issues to do with environmental change become solved through preparing young children for the future, for an uncertain future? And let's look at gender, perspectives and gaps, new debates and gender theories. Look at the stats on the movement of careers with girls from high school, from secondary school, through to higher education, and then look at the stats. I'm a professor. I represent 16% of women in my university, an 800-year-old university of women who get promoted internally. What does that mean? What's that represent? Why is that? Lots of stats, but I'm going to stop there because I've now got 3 minutes to go. The meaning of STEAM is a contentious issue, multivocal, multi-perspectival, and very complex in the literature. And the way STEM is approached, if at all, in school is a very interesting question. New conceptualizations of science and science education are out there. It sets up a whole new set of arguments to be looked at tonight, I hope. STEM disciplines themselves are deemed epistemologically foundational and unnecessarily reject certain ways of knowing. And if we start from the premise of ways of knowing, a sort of epistemological question, where do we go when we see STEM? What does it look like as an act or a collaboration, a team, let alone a pedagogy? And what happens when the arts are infused? So changing conceptualizations of the science and the arts, the relationship between formal school subjects and informal, look at the web, internet technology has really transformed how we learn, where we learn, when we learn. And the potential of arts-based creative pedagogies to foster inclusivity, participatory and interdisciplinary learning is something very close to this particular project. I'm now going to end with a few of the findings that we found from the Cambridge Symposium, where we invited 30 people, including STEAM practitioners, thinking of Nick Corsten, who runs STEAM Co, thinking of the Cambridge Science Centre, which infuse their practices with arts, thinking of schools that have actually had STEAM events, often one-day events, just one-offs, but have engaged communities and parents and artists in the creation of learning through STEAM practices. As the day proceeded, it became clear that different understandings and discourses of STEAM and STEM came into play. And we'll see that tonight. That's the first thing. Different understandings, different discourses. The accounts of the speakers pointed to a variety of practices, and each one pointed to generating engagement from pupils. So those that presented practices, and there's plenty on YouTube. I've got books here, Emerging Technologies for STEAM Education. Gorgeous book with lots of practices around STEAM generated and emerging through technologies. Another book, which is wonderful, by a Swedish chap, looking at the heart of art and earth, an exploration of practices in arts-based environmental education, a wonderful repository of ideas for STEAM and STEM practices. And another book, Inspiring STEM Minds, I'm pleased to say, with lots of women as models in here. So that's just 3. I could have bought a rucksack of more. But essentially, there's a lot of discussion around these topics. We also saw in Cambridge with these 30 guests, participants expressed interest in discussing the difference between STEM and STEAM. Think about it yourself. How would you describe STEM and STEAM? And there were doubts expressed as to how STEAM education would make a change to current practices, especially in schools. How could we do it with Ofsted, with tests, tasks, tables? To further complicate the discussions in a faculty of education, there was, of course, the gendered practice exhibiting similar disjunctures in people's experience and in their views. The mathematicians, the women who became mathematicians, and the research that has been looking at masculine pedagogies and masculine subjects, feminine subjects. The discussions also looked at the role of the arts within STEAM frameworks. And there was the idea that the arts might be able to receive greater educational capital if we got on board and became STEAM, hey, because we're at the edges, we're being pushed out. So could STEAM at least leave us somewhere at the margins? At other times there were arguments around STEM proponents seeing the arts as an avenue for making their subject more relevant, more fun, more enjoyable. There were others that said it could introduce a sort of feminine friendliness to the subject, and rather than the traditionally male-dominated masculine ways of teaching as well. And so we came to a sort of view that STEAM is a holistic approach to teaching the arts and sciences, and STEAM as a way to teach the sciences through art was a great idea, and that STEAM could increase the appeal and relevance of the arts and sciences, and that STEAM as a way to connect the arts to the currency of educational policy making would be valuable, and that STEAM is what is done in industry, but not acknowledged to the extent that it should to get the attention of governments. And certainly a large discussion was around STEAM as an intervention against gendered practice. And we left it there. The next meeting will be in Warwick, where practitioners, artists who work with teachers in communities, in formal settings and formal settings, will come together looking at the theory and practice of STEAM from an artist's perspective across a number of subjects. So, watch this space. More to be said. 3 minutes and over.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Derek Bell. He's a teacher, researcher, advisor and advocate for improving and enriching education for all. He worked in schools and universities before becoming Chief Executive of the Association for Science Education and Head of Education at the Wellcome Trust. He remains very active in education nationally and internationally through his consultancy, Campanula Consulting, committee and advisory work, and has a wide range of publications. He's a current trustee of the IBM Trust UK, Understanding Animal Research and Centre of the Cell in the UK, a number of inter-academies, panel Global Science Education Panel, and a judge for the European Union Competition for Young Scientists. He was awarded an honorary Doctorate of Education by Manchester Metropolitan University in 2011. Derek is a Director of Learners, Professor of Education in the College of Teachers, and a Visiting Research Associate at UCL Institute of Education in London. Derek.
Thank you. Looking round, I'm not quite sure what or who you are. So I'm going to ask you some questions. How many people here regard themselves as an arts person? How many as a science person? The technology? Yeah? Okay. How many people are teachers? Okay, right. I'll just change what I'm going to say. Basically, what I want to try and do is I just want to raise a couple of questions at the beginning, because I think in this day and age, we too often start using words and we don't know what they mean. I mean something, but you mean something different. And I think we need to be clear about what we're trying to solve. I just want to make some observations about the curriculum in general, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I'll say something about science, because it is misunderstood in many respects, and then I'll come back to the problem of STEAM eventually, which of course everybody understands as well, because when you see the kettle boiling and the stuff you see is what we call steam, and actually that isn't steam. Steam is the bit in the middle that you can't see. I think that's another story. So basically my first question here is what are we trying to solve? What's the problem we're trying to solve here by moving from STEM to STEAM? There's enough problem in the STEM world getting the STEM people to work together, never mind having to bring in other groups as well. So what's the problem? Is it to raise the profile of the arts which I mean that very generally, in schools, particularly in the light of recent government approaches to curriculum. Because if that's what it is, then maybe the solutions that we're looking for are slightly different to other things. Is it actually an attempt to do something about the STEM world, make it more cuddly, make it more attractive for young people to actually attend and to therefore get more students in? So that, again, would require slightly different approaches. Is it purely economic? Is it about improving the quality of the workforce and therefore the quality, the future of our economic growth? And if it's that, then we're not alone, certainly not alone. Every developing country in the world, I think, is trying to do that, and they see STEM in particular as a driving force to move that forward. Or are we actually just trying to provide a really good, high-quality, rounded education for all our young people? Because if we're doing that, then we need to perhaps think about things in another way as well and start. My view is it's got to be the latter. If you get the latter right, the other things start to follow on. And the trouble is, sometimes we get too focused on the short-term goal, and therefore we lose the bigger picture. And since my science background for what it was that of ecology, which is dealing with big systems, actually that big picture to me is always important, because it's then how those interact within that system that actually starts to help us understand what drives the system, what makes it change, what actually suits the components of the system, whether they're living or non-living, that actually make it work and operate effectively together. So that's the sort of set of questions that are floating around in my head where I start off on this. The curriculum observation, anybody by any chance recognise that? No, I wouldn't expect necessarily. It was a very historic document. It's 40-odd years old. It was actually pre-national curriculum. And it was starting the debate about what should be in a national curriculum in actual fact. And it talked about a number of things, one of which I'll give you a little story about in a minute. Areas of learning and experience. And it said that children, all of us in fact, as we go through education, need to have experience and learn around the aesthetic and creative, human and social, linguistic and literary, mathematical, moral, physical, that is in our physical, bodily, PE type stuff, not physics, scientific, spiritual and technological aspects of our world and our lives. And if that's what we're trying to get in education, then actually how do we do that is a big question. And it's interesting because everybody interprets them in a different way. Just after this came out, when I was in the classroom, the county did a survey to find out people's perception of those different things. And there was one PE teacher who actually said in PE they dealt with the spiritual and moral aspects of children's education. And in that room, nobody believed them. And yet, actually, that person, where else in the curriculum, any other subject, do you actually talk about working to the rules, being a member of a team, supporting each other, etc.? That often is in different parts. So filling that in is part of that programme. Getting down to more specifics, that was then refined down to saying, actually, the curriculum ought to be broad, have breadth, that's covering the science, the arts, the humanities, and the whole. It needs balance, so it doesn't, you're going to get a diet of one thing, you get the balance. And actually, each one is then given the appropriate degree of attention, which may be to do with the individual, but it also may be to do with the actual community that you're working in. It should be relevant, so that it meets the pupils' needs, not necessarily as we see them, but as well as they see them. Because if they don't see it as being relevant to them, then why bother? And that is really something that we have to challenge. It's got to allow, therefore, for differentiation. so that some children will get something which is different to others because that matches their interests, their capabilities, their particular inclinations, etc. At the same time as all that, it needs to allow some space to follow something in depth. One of the most frustrating things that I think I used to find at school was that you'd get all of this and you wouldn't be allowed to go any further. There ought to be space to allow individual students to go into depth in different aspects of the curriculum. And finally, it's got to go somewhere. There's no point getting to a point of saying, well, that's it, you're finished, you've done your exam, you don't need. It should have, within the curriculum itself, some progression and continuity, but also something which might stimulate you as an individual or as a group or whatever to go beyond that, outside of the education environment, and that leads into the whole process of lifelong learning and the development that you've actually built up the basis to follow interests after school. Because actually you can't do everything in school, there isn't time. And if you remember that actually, even when you are going to school full time, in those 8 years maybe, less than 20% of your time is in school. So there's a lot of time out there and a lot of life out there to carry on learning. So learning isn't just within school. And as if that lot, that was 40 years ago, but actually it still exists today. You look at the national curriculum and you read the bit at the front of the national curriculum for England, it still refers to the spiritual, the moral aspects of life. But nobody ever reads that because they only look at the subject bits that come later. So we've got to remember that not only have do those things still exist, but you are expected to help children develop some of those aspects as part of their education, as well as prepare them for their life after school, which includes work, but includes leisure and being a member of society generally. And the interesting thing that we always forget, and it was made very, very explicit in this most recent version of the national curriculum in England, and probably the only thing that I would go with, but it said very clearly the national curriculum is only part of the school curriculum. Therefore, there is time, or there should be time, in school where students are allowed and enabled to do things which go beyond the requirements of the national curriculum. So I think that's an important point to remember. The other problem with a curriculum, and this is probably where a lot of the real problems arise, is it's not the curriculum as written. It's not necessarily the curriculum as enacted in the school. It's the accountability that schools are put under in order to make the curriculum and to actually say whether they're doing a good job. And we have different measures. And of course, probably the EBAC, if I dare mention that word, is the one that's created the biggest hoo-ha around lately. Partly because it's restricted a lot of aspects and has dealt the arts a very bad hand, to be honest. But the interesting thing about that is that, as one of the people in the department said to me when I was interviewing about another project, actually, he said, that is, from their point of view, a perfect intervention because it was announced, it cost no money, and schools were changing their behaviour within 12 months. That's a successful intervention, if you like, because that's what they thought they were going to be measured on. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't get too bogged down in that, although we can't ignore it. The other thing I would say is that actually the national curriculum, if you read it carefully, up to the age of 14, students do have to do the whole range of subjects. They do have to do the arts, the humanities, the science. It's after the age of 14 that things change because those accountability measures particularly click in at the age of 16. So again, we come back to my original questions. What problem are we trying to solve? Is it actually only 2 years of the education system, or is it the whole thing? And that's sort of where I think we need to go. Enough on the curriculum. What about science? Shout if I'm going too long. Interesting thing about STEM, just imagine this. I was going to do one PowerPoint slide and I thought, no, I won't. But just imagine the word STEM in capital letters. If you had to change the size of those letters to which is the most prominent in school, which would you put as the top of the list? Which would be your biggest letter, S, T, E or M, as the one which is the most prominent in school? Any offers? Sorry? M? Yeah, okay, I'd go with M, yeah. Next? S, yeah. And the others somewhere along the line, yeah. If you were doing that out in, I will use the phrase, the real world, which would be a big letter then?
E. E.
I've got an offer of E. Any advance on an offer of E? T. E and T. Complete reverse. It's really fascinating. So why is it that some kids don't find science and maths particularly sexy? Because it doesn't seem to affect them in the world. They're hidden. You know, Intel had that promotion where Intel Inside, you know, was partly to promote the idea of having the physics and the chips and stuff inside, you know, that sort of thing. So, image of science, maths and STEM is an issue. And one of the problems with that, and I'm talking here probably a little bit more about school science than science in general, because a lot of kids and people find science interesting. It's just not for them. However, if you look at it, school science, the image is that it's very precise, very analytical, the answers are black and white, and there's no scope for your own ideas. That's one of the images that it has. And actually, that's not science at all. That's following recipes. That could be chemistry. No, sorry. I won't say it's chemistry. But it's important that science isn't that. Science is actually opportunities to develop thinking, to actually explore ideas, to test ideas. The difference between that and some other disciplines is you can do it empirically and you should be able to reproduce it. And that's where it is slightly different. But actually it does allow that. The other thing about science is that it's supposed to be amoral, that actually it's neither good nor bad. Maybe that's true, but the way it's used certainly can be good, bad, or both. And students in school don't get a chance to actually debate that. They don't get any chance to look at that in the context, the cultural context, when particular discoveries were made, or why they were driven in a particular way. So in terms of STEM, we have to start to deal with images. I could go on and talk about other images, but actually those just illustrate the point. And so by actually starting to think about how you bring the arts into a relationship with STEM, you start to open up other avenues. Science is culturally situated. If you look at the textbooks that you had at school, although you're nowhere near as old as I am, most of you, actually we only got one version of science. We missed a whole host of other things that were going on and developed in other parts. We got Western science. We didn't get other aspects of science. And we need to understand not only how science is culturally situated in the past, how it also drives culture, the technology we use, you know, how we respond to music, how we respond to art, how we engage with it. All are actually, in part, driven by the technologies that we have now, not actually anything more fundamental or theoretical. It's just simply, it's there, so we use it. How often do you sit and listen to a piece of music and not do anything else these days? More often than not, it's going on while you're doing something else. You're doing your emails or whatever. You know, it really is quite an interesting area. And I come back to the point about science, and I would argue technology and engineering to a certain extent, people do find, and kids find interesting, but they don't see it as being for them. and that is a particular issue with girls, aspects for girls. So in terms of promoting and developing the idea of STEM and linking that to the arts, we've got to start thinking about that cultural aspect, how the science and the technology fits into the culture, how it relates and it informs and develops the arts, and the whole issue about the globalization and competitiveness arguments that we go. Where does it fit? What does it mean in part of that? And that way, not only should we be developing the knowledge and the skills of these different disciplines, but we also develop a genuine appreciation of them and the part that they play in our lives and in our world and society generally. So to end, basically, STEAM as opposed to STEM, yes, I would say so, but I would come back to say, what do we really mean by that? And that's got to be looked at in more detail and argued out, because simply trying to use it to wedge the arts into STEM, I personally don't think that works. It's a problem. Secondly, what are the benefits we're looking for, and for whom are we giving those benefits? We have to respect there are disciplines out there, there are particular sorts of knowledge. We need to respect that. But how do we get the synergies that those bring together so we actually get more than the sum of the parts? And finally, if we're going to do that, we really do need to think about the curriculum models that we're going to use in terms of school. And indeed, we have to ask the question, and Pamela has touched on it, do we in the future simply have an education system which happens in school, or do we actually take more into account what happens beyond school, the formal, the informal learning that goes on, and how we can help children harness both elements of that to their own benefit and also to the benefit of the society. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Deborah Annetts. Following studying piano to a high level and taking a degree in PPE from Oxford, Deborah Annetts trained as an employment lawyer, becoming a partner in 1998. In May 2008, Deborah became Chief Executive of the Incorporated Society of Musicians, the UK's professional association for music and a subject association for music education, which has approximately 7,500 members from across the music sector and includes both individual musicians, performers, composers, educators and other music industry professionals, as well as music organisations and institutions. In 2012, Deborah headed the Cross Arts campaign Back for the Future. Although successful in securing a U-turn in 2013, the campaign has launched again following the Department for Education's announcements to implement the EBAC, the English Baccalaureate, as a headline measure in secondary schools. In 2014, Deborah led the Protect Music Education campaign to victory, securing an increase in funding for music education of 18 million to 75 million, a figure which has been maintained for 2015-16. Outside of the ISM, Deborah is chair of the Educational Recording Agency, chair of Fair Trials International, a member of the British Copyright Council, and a former chair of the Music Education Council. Deborah.
Thank you. Well, I'm not an educator and I'm not an academic. I'm very practical. So I'm not going to be able to quote lots and lots of research and stuff like that. I'm coming at it from an entirely prosaic and practical point of view. And I was really interested by that question around, as an employer, what are you looking for? Because I employ 20-odd staff, and what am I looking for when I interview somebody? And it's definitely good written skills. I mean, that still is very, very important, the ability to communicate. But I'm also looking for problem solving and creativity and proactivity and drive and engagement and interest and lots of stuff which actually you're not going to get tested on, and you're not going to be able to wave a piece of paper at me and say, I've got an A level in proactivity. It just doesn't exist, although I would like it, actually. So I'm kind of looking at this in a slightly more practical point of view. So I'm not going to be looking at the specifics of STEM or STEAM. I'm going to look at it much more in terms of government policy and what's going on, because it's all rather curious, actually. And sometimes in the music world, I do think we are actually inhabiting Alice in Wonderland, because nothing really quite adds up. So that's what I'm just going to be picking apart. Figures published by our own government in January 2016 this year showed that the UK's creative industries grew by 8.9% in 2014, almost double the UK economy as a whole. They are worth almost £10 million an hour. That's quite a big figure, £10 million an hour. Our creative industries are now worth a record £84 billion to the UK economy, with music alone generating £2 billion a year in terms of exports. So the next time somebody poo-poos music, just say, exports. And when you put that aside to the side of the financial and insurance services that we hear a lot about, and we've been hearing a lot about that in terms of the EU debate, they contribute £126 billion, so not much more than the creative industries. A really important stat. And construction is worth £90 billion, just a bit more than the creative industries. So when you put those side by side, you start to see something around policy and where we should be looking at in terms of GDP, etc. In addition, as we know, there are huge technological shifts going on, and that is happening globally, and all countries are trying to work out how to do it. It's definitely touching on the EU debate. Are we better off inside or outside Europe? Trade agreements, all that kind of stuff. And in a very interesting piece of work conducted by Oxford University and Deloitte, they found that 35% of current jobs in the UK are at high risk of computerisation over the next 20 years. It's the threat of automation. So it's like the Industrial Revolution again. And what does that mean for the UK economy and also people having jobs? Because jobs are central to communities, to status, to pride, to engagement, to all kinds of things. And if 35% of jobs are at risk, then we should be having a think about how we protect ourselves. And when you start unpicking that, the risk is not so great around the creative industries. So although there are obviously in the West End digital music being played in some theatres, not many, but some, actually what we've seen in terms of live music is that's been going up in terms of what people want. Likewise with theatre, it's had a tremendously successful couple of years, actually bounced back against the recession. Animation, we know how terrifically successful that has been, gaming off the records, absolutely amazing, design, visual arts, etc. Very little of that is actually subject to automation. So something else we should be thinking about. And indeed, back in November 2015, the Chancellor said, Britain's not just brilliant at science. It was as if he'd suddenly had that moment of, goodness me, look at this. It's brilliant at culture too. Revelation. One of the best investments we can make as a nation is in our extraordinary arts, museums, heritage, media and sport. Yes, George, you've got it right. It is therefore really odd that we see some very strange policy directions coming out of the DFE, particularly when at virtually the same time George Osborne decided, because Sir Simon Rattle is coming back to be the conductor to the LSO, let's build a concert hall. Let's spend close on, is it £300 million on the new concert hall and revising the Barbican and some money for LSO St Luke's Discovery and also for the Guildhall. Let's spend £300 million and we're going to have a world-class concert hall, we're going to have a wonderful education facility, we're going to have an amazing digital offer, and it might be about London or it might be national, we're not quite certain. That's a really interesting concept. Obviously, there's a question mark as to whether we need it or not, but how does it sit against some of the stuff we're hearing from the DFE? Alongside all of this, the Treasury has issued a whole range of tax breaks, huge numbers of tax breaks, focusing around the creative industries. And they range from theatre to film to gaming, and the one that ISM worked on was orchestras. And partly that is around, well, if we create a tax break, then you're not going to need so much government funding. Partly it's about that, but partly it's because the soft brand of UK is around culture and cultural exports. So it's right that we should be looking at trying to engineer our tax system so that it can support our creative industries. And we've had the Cultural White Paper, which also endorsed the importance of creativity and said that there is a recognition that there is a need for facilities that allow artists to develop and create new work. So that's all kind of a piece, if you think about it. You've got culture, you've got the Treasury, you've got George saying culture is important, and you've got a lot of issues all bound up there in relation to government policy. And then you have the DFE. And you do wonder if they talk to one another. I mean, I presume they do because they have cabinet meetings. And I presume somewhere there is a plan, you know, a strategic plan with outputs and KPIs and all that kind of stuff, I presume. But sometimes you do wonder whether there is much communication going on. And obviously communication is one of the core skills we're hopefully learning at school. But you do wonder because, as we all know, we've got the EBAC. And we've had the EBAC 1, and just like Back for the Future, we've got EBAC 2 now, which is very exciting. So back in 2013, Michael Gove said that the EBAC was a bridge too far. And it did sound a bit like, you know, bridge over the River Kwai, you know, we can't quite get there. We're going to not do that. And instead, we're going to have Progress 8, and I think it's Best 8. No, Best something. But we're going to have a different set of measures instead. We're not going to go down the EBAC route. And I think there was much relief from the educational establishment that we were not going to have this incredibly restrictive way of treating education. Obviously, we've been through the whole redesigning the curriculum, and again, the ISM was very much involved in music. And that was a very strange experience because we had lots of conversations with the DFE officials who would tell us, but Michael wants this. Michael wants this canon. And we tried to explain that actually music technology was quite important these days. And we were firmly told that's not how Michael sees music. And in fact, the canon that was coming out was very much, and I did get quoted on this and got into trouble, you know, dead white Germans, but it seriously was. And it wasn't around how people, youngsters, actually are experiencing music and what would bring music alive and make it relevant for youngsters' learning. We tried as far as we could also to bring copyright into the curriculum because it had been there at Key Stage 3. But again, the minister took the very firm view that people learning music didn't need to know about copyright. Well, I don't know how many of you are musicians in this audience, but I can tell you that 40% of the 1,500 legal queries we get in every year are about copyright from musicians. So absolutely, you need to understand copyright if you're going to make your living out of this particular area. So we did what we could. We got the EBAC reversed. We heaved a sigh of relief. And then the general election happened. July last year, EBAC came back. And we thought, we can't believe this. We're going to have to launch the EBAC campaign again. And very soon, it became apparent this was worse than EBAC 1 because it's being treated as a headline measure that Ofsted is supposed to be enforcing. And when you look at the composition of it, it is much more restrictive. And it is all about ensuring that children are getting a minimum of 7 GCSEs in those EBAC subjects. I think the target is 90%. And I honestly don't know how that's going to work. But that is what the government have decided on. And I don't think there's any research, because I've met the various policy people responsible for this and asked them why 90%. And they couldn't give me a reason. So it's not as if it's backed up by any evidence. Somebody's just plucked the figure of 90% out of the air. And of course, you know, if you were a teacher marking that work, you would say, show your workings, and there are no workings, which is deeply troubling. And indeed, the configuration of the EBAC means that some pupils will end up being forced into undertaking 10 GCSEs without any kind of access to an arts one. And there isn't really any evidence, again, to support that these particular subjects are particularly valid over other non-EBAC subjects. And again, if you're making this policy shift, then surely you need to be basing it on evidence. And as Derek said, it's a fantastic measure because it costs you nothing and everybody's behaviour starts changing. But I do think, particularly when you look at the other parts of government, it should be joined up and it should be based on evidence. Now, we have brought together now over 200 organisations from right across the creative sector, and also schools and trade unions, theatres, visual arts establishments, technology companies, you name it, they have joined the backforthefuture.com campaign, 200, which is an amazing group of people, organisations to come together. We've also worked with other individuals around a petition which has now got to over 100,000, calling for a discussion in Parliament about this proposal, because there's not been a single parliamentary debate in the House of Commons on this really very important and behaviour-changing policy. We have secured a debate on the 4th of July, and we are now at the stage of urging everybody, and I'm going to ask everybody in this room, when you go home, to write a letter to your MP if you think the arts are important. You can go on to backforthefuture.com and you will find a pro forma letter. You can tweak it, you can do whatever you like to it, you can use your creativity and send that letter out, but it's really important that you send that letter out. Because at the moment, the Tory party is all over the place, as you will all know. They're at loggerheads. And what that means is that there are quite a few Tory MPs willing to dissent. And if we can work with those dissenters, we might be able to generate another U-turn, which is why your act of writing to your local MP is so profoundly important. And there are various other things that you can do, because if we don't do that, we are going to continue to see the slide in our creative subjects within schools, where it's the wealthier who can study music. Why? Because they have access to tuition outside of school. And if you look at what's happening with GCSE results, the top grades are increasingly just being achieved by independent schools. And that cannot be right. We cannot have apartheid in our arts system. That is profoundly wrong. It goes against what it is to be a human being. Everybody should have the right to be educated in the arts. So this is not just about trying to address the issues around the creative industries and making sure that we are generating enough GDP. It is, I think, much more on a much deeper basis about what it is to be a human being, and we mustn't deny those children going through secondary school and indeed primary school access to such a fundamental part of their artistic education. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Nico MacDonald. He is Chief Executive of the Research and Development Society and co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. Previously, he was Head of Innovation at the Creative Industries INET. He's written extensively on the design and creativity for publications, including the BBC News Online, the Guardian newspaper, the RSA Journal, iMagazine, Blueprint, Building Design and Creative Review. He was an early promoter of creative and design engagement with the web and is author of What is Web Design? And you can read more about that at spy.co.uk. Nico.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I've been taking notes on this discussion, so please forgive me if you think I've been texting loved ones or some such. I'm trying to write something about this theme more extensively, so I'm hoping that, we've had some very interesting, thoughtful points made so far. Just briefly, the Research and Development Society is a professional membership organisation for anyone interested or involved in R&D, and that includes in the arts, which is not a traditional area in which R&D is considered, all the way through to the more traditional areas of technology and engineering and manufacturing. My background is not as an educator or an academic, as our previous speaker attested, but I'm have some other qualifications. My father worked up the road for the Inner London Education Authority. Anyone old enough to remember that? Put their hands up. Developing learning materials in a progressive way, which was then abolished by the Tories in 1982, although I have to say after he had left. I have two kids in education, one in primary and secondary, and that's been quite a salutary experience in understanding the role of arts and creativity in education. The second area that I'm qualified in, if you like, is I've worked quite a lot with STEAMco, which was mentioned by Pamela earlier on, which is a independent campaign activity organisation working with schools and young people to inspire them around creativity and to bring the kind of energy to the engagement with that we see in other areas of academic life, hopefully, but not always. As you can see from The Economist today, the subject of teaching is very much at the forefront, even in the era of the EU referendum. So I'm pleased we're having this debate right now, not least in the context of EBAC 2 that we've been hearing about as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about the idea of why knowing just about one area of knowledge is not sufficient for real learning, and then talk a bit about the relationship of arts, technology, design and creativity, and then look at what is education for, and I think pick up on some of the points that Derek has been making. And then look at the question of the role of STEM and future prosperity, which is one of the questions that Miguel set us. And then ask whether we can get our arts, creativity, design outside of the school. And then finally reflect on why it is that we've got to this stage. We do, I think, need to ask what the A in STEAM is, and we have touched on that already, and there are a number of interpretations. Arts, creativity, design and music is one of them, or as one of my colleagues has suggested, design, creativity and innovation. And I think very much as Derek did, we need to know what question we're answering and what the subject matter we're talking about is. I'm going to go a bit more with the latter, even though we're in the music department at City University, and think about creativity in a more general sense. So the first question I want to ask is, what does she or he know about science or STEM who only STEM knows? Which is, to rephrase, quite a common idea. Can you really know a subject if that's the only thing that you know? What do you know about its significance in terms of its origin, in terms of its intellectual development, in terms of the way it's interacted with and often come out of other areas of life, of intellectual and didactic practice? The idea of science itself is a concept which is only 200 years old. The term was coined only in the 1830s, and before that we talked about natural philosophy, which implicitly has a very different derivation from the way that we understand science today. Also, many people who are significant people working in STEM, technologists, scientists, mathematicians, actually have a very rich background in other areas. Sometimes they studied those areas, sometimes they've adopted them, sometimes they have practiced them in other ways. Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, the neuroscientist, was interviewed on the Life Scientific recently and talked about creativity and imagination being key components of science. Marcus de Sautoy, people may know as the Arsenal supporting Oxford mathematician, was interviewed on the same show only this week and talked about the challenges that he'd had from creative artists about the way that he thinks and how much they've helped him with his work. And in a way, creativity, the arts and so on were actually informing the way that he was thinking about mathematics. And he thinks about multi-dimensional aspects of mathematics which you wouldn't normally associate with the arts. There are many people in the world of technology, which I work in part in, who have very strong leanings towards music. For instance, Jeff Raskin, who died now about 10 years ago, who really can lay claim to be the originator of the graphical user interface at Apple, although Steve Jobs kind of edged him aside, is passionate about music and making instruments. Yet he was a technologist, maybe a designer technologist. Jaron Lanier, who some people might know and associate with the origins of virtual reality, which we're seeing a kind of renaissance in around Oculus Rift and other technologies today, is an experimenter with many historical instruments, and I interviewed him at the RSA some years ago, where he demonstrated a very obscure wind instrument, which he claimed was in a way a progenitor of digital music because of the way in which it was structured and played. Also, I think there's the area of pure knowledge you can't really learn pure knowledge in its own terms. There's if you've had children, if you've worked with kids, if you've studied child development, there's a very physical and haptic and bodily way in which children learn, and in which I think adults learn. You can't really appreciate many apparently abstract concepts without actually having a sense of physical space, of your body in that space, of how you interact with things. And that's something which actually comes from the arts as well. So historically, I would say the arts and scientists have always complemented each other. It's an obvious point to make that artists and scientists were, historically often the same people. And just as an example, there's an exhibition at the Waterman's Art Centre in Brentford at the moment on the work of Darcy Thompson, who authored a very influential publication called On Growth and Form in the early part of the 20th century, which very much bridged the arts and the sciences. So I think it's, what should we say, naive, if not ignorant of our legislators and policymakers to think that the arts and sciences are somehow disparate. Obviously, you can come back to C.P. Snow, who gets endlessly quoted on these things as well. It's a much more subtle thing than that, and most of the people in each of those domains actually don't really operate in those domains. The second area I want to look at is what education is for, and I think I will very much echo Derek's points on this. But I think education should really be about teaching people how to learn. Right? It should be about teaching children how to appreciate culture, how to appreciate knowledge in and of itself, for its own sake. It's not an instrumental thing. Again, many people will point out that the kind of industries that people will be working in, the kind of jobs they'll be doing, are changing at a tremendous rate, and you can't educate people and teach them practical skills for the industries they'll need, other than the reading and writing and collaboration and so on that are general. So I would argue, and I think again this government and the previous government show a terrible ignorance when they think that education is really this instrumental thing to get people into jobs. The things that I studied when I was at school helped me to learn how to think, how to be a human being in a way, a moral subject, as Derek has talked about. But they're not things I apply in my day-to-day work, and I would challenge any of you even to remember what you did in your STEM or STEAM subjects at A-level or O-level or GCSE or whatever you did. And yet you still come here as people who are able to engage in this discussion, able to engage with other people, able to engage in work and creativity, and that's a function of your education. Albert Einstein famously said, education is what remains after one has forgotten what one learned at school. And I doubt many people would disagree with that. Education should be about following the threads of your curiosity and appreciating the value of disparate knowledge. And I say this as something of an autodidact who listens to Radio 4 and Radio 3 almost constantly when I'm not trying to do anything creative myself. And the amount of ideas that you have from places you would never expect is absolutely amazing. And that's just one broadcaster and 2 channels. If you look at the best schools in this country, which are often private or independent schools, the idea that STEAM, the arts, creativity and so on is not important is really contradicted, because those schools emphasise those things tremendously, and it's only schools like my son's school about a quarter of a mile away from here where the music education got cut because of funding cuts and so on, and that's not going to happen at the City of London Boys Preparatory School or any of these other kind of schools. So I think we should look and aspire to the best our society has to offer, and that is seen in the best schools. We do have a real problem in this country in that we try and specialise our education too quickly. And I attended a lecture by Baroness Blackstone, some people may know, who was Vice-Chancellor of Greenwich University until recently, and gave the Gresham College special lecture yesterday. And she talked about the 16 to 18 curriculum being far too narrow and the need to move towards a baccalaureate system, although probably not the one that's being proposed at the moment. And also reflect on the way in which universities inhibit this, because baccalaureate suggests that you might study 5 subjects in year 12 and 4 in year 13, and yet universities only require 3 A levels. So essentially no one's going to study more subjects while that's the requirement. So that's my reflections on what education is for, and I think the instrumentalism that we see around knowledge is a very dangerous thing, because it actually doesn't equip people at all well for the future, even if maybe it might equip them for the very short term. As to whether STEM is key to future prosperity, which is one of the arguments that's made and one that Miguel asked us to reflect on, the idea that pure science or just engineering actually creates prosperity is a very fraught argument. You know, science is essentially about discovering the laws of nature. It's about trying to understand things. But the difference between that and the kind of innovations which transform society, which we use to transform our societies, are enormous. So science leads to the creation of technology, leads to the creation of engineering. But even engineering in and of itself is not transformative. It's only when those things are instantiated in a social need, in the supporting technologies to make those things viable, in the skills needed to make and support that product, which may also be a service these days. The design of the thing, how do you make it useful, usable and desirable? The business models that support that innovation, the organisational culture which creates it, the leadership which shapes the organisation and has the vision for how it might be, and fashion. What are the trends which shape what we want? All those things ultimately shape the kind of things that we create and that we adopt, and that will create value and wealth and increase the comfort that we live in, increase the productivity that we have at work. One of our board members, Uday Fadka, is publishing a book later this year called Camels, Tigers and Unicorns, which very much looks at the way in which those things come together in order to successfully or unsuccessfully create real innovations in society. So it's a very limited mindset which thinks that science in and of itself, and you can see if people are familiar with graphene. People heard of graphene here? It's a discovery made at the University of Manchester by, as it happens, two non-British scientists of a new carbon-based material which is superconductive, super strong and incredibly flexible. And yet that discovery has not led to any significant creation of wealth in the UK, because all the other factors which I've outlined are not in place for Britain to exploit it. So essentially, if we're just educating people in STEM, as one of my colleagues has pointed out, you create people who are robotic users of technology, and the kind of breadth and didacticism and interest in other subjects and so on, which is characteristic of the best technologists and engineers and designers, is something which is critical to the real realization of the possibilities of, ostensibly, the STEM in the real world. I wrote an article in an online journal called Spite just before the mayoral election, arguing that we needed to create a nation, or at least a third way in the economy of London, around what I call creative technology, which London has creative industries, which has been outlined very clearly. We also have very good science, very good engineering. How can we bring those things together to create the kind of products which are not being created in China or Japan, are not being created in France or Germany, are not being created in the United States or Canada, because those countries, cultures, their economies and so on are very focused on one aspect, if you like, of creative technology. And I think if we can appropriately, if we want to be instrumental about it, that's the direction that we should be going in. I'm going to cut my remarks a bit short because I think Miguel will be keen to get to debate, as I'm sure everyone else will. But I just wanted to reflect a little bit on how we got here. And we've talked a little bit about how we've got a culture of testing, of examination, and so on. And it seems to me that maths, as Derek has talked about it, in the way it's taught at least, and the sciences are much more amenable to the kind of testing culture that we love so much. The kind of micromanaging politicians like to be able to say we're 10% better at this and so on, because unless they can substantiate things in figures, they really can't believe in what they're doing, because they have no bigger beliefs, no paradigms, no qualitative aspirations. They just want to, in the most mechanical way, assess young people in terms of how well they're doing in school. And the arts, creativity, design, innovation, you can't really measure those things in those ways. And the other factor, I think, in a way, is that our politicians, our political leaders, and perhaps our policymakers are more narrow in their background. They don't have a kind of hinterland that their forebears might have had. And I just wanted to quote Dennis Healy, Lord Healy, who died in the last year, who said, "I've always been interested in music, painting and poetry, as in politics. You have to have a hinterland," he said, or perhaps his wife said, but it's more often assigned to him as a quote. And Shirley Williams, who was a collaborator with Healy until the early 80s, recorded that Healy had a phenomenal knowledge of classical music and even knew the Kirkle numbers of pieces he listened to, which even for a well-rounded musician would be an achievement. So people like Healy, and he's not the only example in post-war British political life, are exemplary of politicians who had a hinterland, who didn't think life was just about politics, whereas I challenge you to find many politicians in Parliament today who had that breadth of a knowledge of culture and things beyond the Westminster bubble. So a closing note, there has been a movement to say that creativity and design are new ways of thinking, and this is almost sort of going against the arguments I've been critiquing at the moment, and proposing that they are new ways of thinking about how you design organisations, how you design curricula, how you educate people, and so on. It's a movement which is loosely called design thinking, promoted really from the US by some very interesting, if what should we say, slightly hinterland light design practitioners. And I'll just point out that this kind of model of thinking in itself is quite narrow. I don't think we're going to get much of an argument for it in the UK. We do need to be wary of going too far and bending the stick too much in the other direction of the A in STEAM, because often we end up doing the same thing in arts and culture and creativity that the people we're attacking, if you like, are doing around STEM. So to conclude, I think we need to respect education and knowledge for its own sake, and that is the best way to create people who are both morally good citizens, and also ultimately will be entrepreneurial and creative and good people to work with, to work for, or to work for you. I think we need to think again about what future industries we might be creating. And if we're going to be instrumental about things, actually be realistic and not try and recreate the industries of the past in the way in which we educate our young people. I think we do need to revisit how we teach arts and design particularly in schools, as in my experience it's definitely not taught by the best people, and it's definitely not taught in a way which is really reflective of the breadth and maturity and wisdom of those domains. On the other hand, to use the American expression, I think Tom Wolfe coined it originally, we mustn't drink the Kool-Aid of design thinking and the creative industries and believe too much in that, because the Kool-Aid doesn't taste so good after a while. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all our panellists. I'm going to start with a question, but I'm hoping that the panellists might have wanted to pick up on some things so we'll do that after, and then we'll open to the floor for questions from the audience. So I just wanted to pick up on something in Derek's presentation, because you said the national curriculum is only part of the school curriculum. But we also heard from other panellists that means that certain other bits of the curriculum are squeezed out because the schools aren't measured on those. So you described it as the perfect intervention because it has changed sort of behaviour. But Nick Gibb, the school minister, is claiming the opposite. That he's saying the claim that the EBAC squeezes out the arts is quite simply wrong. Since the EBAC was introduced, the percentage of state school pupils entered for at least one GCSE in art subjects has increased from 46% to 50%, so on and so on and so on. And people can participate in the arts, unlike other art subjects, they can exist outside of the formal school curriculum. Just wondered if we have any reflections on that. How do we think about that balance? In essence, what should be core and what shouldn't be core, and how do these things relate to each other?
Well, firstly, do we know whether he's using correct stats? Because I'm not sure he is.
It's not.
Interestingly, when they came up with that particular set of stats, at the same time, the Joint Council for Qualifications and Cultural Learning Alliance contradicted the claim and said that the figures published by the DFE did not include design and technology or all the arts qualifications. They'd also admitted BTEC qualifications where there had been a sharp decline. So actually, when you add up all the relevant stats, you'll see it's going down. And the results that have literally just been announced in relation to music GCSE show a fall of 3% and A-level is down 8%. And that's all linked back to the EBAC.
No, sorry, going back to the basic point about national curriculum, it was never intended to take up all the time, right from the very beginning. It was the way it was implemented, it was the testing that was put on, and it's the same whether you're in primary or secondary school. You know, if you think you're going to be tested on X, then that's what you will do. And so it's been that that's pushed it out. It's not the curriculum itself. And the EBAC was a particularly bad example. And I will just say, it is not a baccalaureate. He doesn't understand what one is. And actually, if we had a proper baccalaureate at the end of year 13, then I would be very happy to have something of that nature, because it actually does provide that balance. But it also provides some depth, because most of the students in the IB, they do a special study. And that allows them to follow their own interest. And if it's worked properly, it really is something that they value. And I think universities value it as well.
So the question is whether the arts, the A, can be studied outside school and isn't critical or core to the curriculum. I mean, I actually was going to say something about that, but for reasons of length, didn't. I think school, in a way, should be a holistic thing. Right? Every parent, aspirational parent, is going to encourage their kids to learn outside of school. But since we're so concerned with equality and inequality these days, if that's really key to your children's education, then the school is not doing enough. Because as we know, with cramming for exams and having tutorials and so on, that's what wealthy parents do to get their kids ahead. Schools should be doing everything and not require anything of parents, even though every parent will want to do those, post or extracurricular kinds of things. And I think actually the truth is science, technology could be taught as well outside of school as the arts. I take my kids to the Royal Institution Christmas lectures and all those things you're supposed to do, and they provide a perfectly good education. It may not be hands-on, but then there are other ways you can get hands-on learning. You can go to Tech Will Save Us and do courses there, or anyone of a fab lab to learn about 3D printing and these kind of things. I just wanted to quote, in fact, Frances Morris from Tate Modern, who's the outgoing director on Front Row this week. She said, "Arts education from early years, emphasising museums as public spaces, is vital." And she was talking about why she'd become interested in the arts. So clearly museums and other institutions are ways in which we can educate ourselves about any STEAM subject. But she was emphasising that it's the education which creates the foundation for appreciating, in her case, the National Maritime Museum, which was near where she grew up. So I think it's a bogus argument.
Yeah, there's so many things to say. And I'm going to pick up on a couple of things. One is the question of social justice. And, in terms of, the challenging inequalities in education, which are just getting wider and wider with all of these government responses, and where we are at the moment in a sort of seismic, what feels like a tsunami of change. And I think our discussion reflects that experience of being in a tsunami of change. If you look at in school and out of school, we've been hearing formal and informal learning and different types of schooling. What we haven't heard is about parents and home. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of discussion with parents in terms of what they think STEAM and STEM is. I've got a doctoral student who's went into 6 family homes in East London looking at how creative learning arises in immigrant family homes. And there, he stayed as an uncle for a year going and visiting. He is a head teacher. And in this study, he's found that the richness of engagement in family homes, the learning that goes on, that is actually not given much credence at all, needs to be recognised. And where our discussion is again sort of siloed in these, where we're just being hit by government reform, government changes. We have to speak out, we have to make change. But how do we do that? By continually reinforcing a sort of traditional view, or is there other models where partnerships with parents, what have you done in your school with your, are you going to just accept that the music has been cut, or can communities start to engage with the school and the gating of a school actually start to dissolve, so that communities engage in the schooling within the schooling? So I'm wanting to just I don't have any answers, I've got more questions, trying to think of what are different models for the 21st century. And I think we need to also think that creativity is not just the remit of the arts, but technology, creates its own form of creativity. The authorship of forms of authorship has changed radically in terms of who owns what and where ideas come from, and how groups work as collaboration, with children working in groups and adults working in groups. Looking at where children learn the most, they are learning from YouTube. They're learning at home, they're learning on their way to school, they're learning together in the playground as well as within the classroom itself. I think there needs to be a revolution in terms of assessment for learning, which is not an old saying, but actually thinking, everybody keeps saying testing and measuring, using old discourse. I think we need new words, and I think we need to disrupt the government's view. I think we need to stand up and really be heard a lot louder than we are. I'm certainly recruiting lots of people to be doing, what you're suggesting with this letter. But this is the way forward. If we're going to have we can make a noise. There's a girl called Hannah McGlosky who is the CEO of a social enterprise called Fearless Futures, and she went into a East London high school and talked to girls about A-levels, their A-levels, and actually she went into the school for a month looking at raising awareness about gender equity. And in one of the A-level classes, she said, look at your curriculum, look at the curriculum that you're studying in terms of whether it's music, whether it's poetry, whether it's novels. Well, one of the girls in her class said, actually, when I think about my music curriculum, there's something like 52 composers. They're all men. They're all pretty much dead and white. And I'm not going to say, we mustn't say it, but there are some contemporary composers, but they were still all men. Now, what happened was she created a Twitter storm. This realisation is sort of hit her like a brick, and she contacted, the government got involved, and the EdXL, I hope that's okay to say, the examination board, got very worried about the public response to this, and this is to strategically get the media involved to shine the light on inequalities. This girl, who's 16, turned it around in 3 weeks, because from there EdXL contacted the National Association of Higher Music Education, of which we're both on the board, and there was a commission to reassign the proportion of men and male and female composers. That happened in 3 weeks. So I do think, and yes, you're hearing it an Australian accent, but I've been here 21 years. So I do think there can be a can-do, really acting on these ideas and doing something about it proactively rather than reactively, and thinking very differently about the discourse we're using and what we're playing into with things called governments.
Can I pick up on that a bit? Because I think, that's all laudable and it's fantastic that happened. But I don't know anyone who thinks the EBAC is a good idea, an educationalist from any camp, and yet we find ourselves in this position again.
Yes.
So what can we do about that? What's the cause of this? Is this because progress is considered to be something that's driven by scientific discovery and that's the thing that remains? What is driving that, and how can we do something about that?
Very conservative governments that think that knowledge, is a canon from a very elitist hierarchical perspective. It's a very narrow, very reductive way of thinking. And they're not basing any of their views on research, any evidence.
No. I think a lot of it is being driven by Nick Gibb, who has a particular world view, which is very much based on his own experience of his education. And I've met him a few times, and the last but one time it was quite an extraordinary meeting, because he wanted to explain to me how music education had certainly gone off the rails, and what we needed to do was to go back to the Open University textbooks of the 1950s, and in particular the sea shanties. And wouldn't it be great if we could bring back the OU educational manuals from the 1950s, and could I please put him in touch with OUP so that he could have a conversation with them, which I did. And set up a meeting. OUP came in. They came in with their new manuals and educational texts, and he brought out his 1950s texts and looked at theirs, and he just said, well, they're all rubbish, aren't they? They're absolute rubbish. You don't want those. You want these 1950s texts. And the civil servant looked at these 1950s texts and said, Minister, I'm not sure we can do this. Because actually they're very sexist and racist. So it is a particular worldview based on a particular set of core beliefs around kind of grad grind education, which is informing national policy. And it's deeply, deeply worrying. And therefore, I'm afraid we have to say no, because no one else is going to do it. And I don't even know if we're going to be able to be successful, but we're going to have a jolly good go, because if we don't, no one else will. And there is a further problem. It's not just government, it's also the stuff that comes out of the Daily Mail all the time, and all their sets of values and beliefs, etc. And we frankly just have to be noisier and more vocal, and as you say, start setting a different way of looking at education. Because listen, the CBI say that it's all rubbish as well. And if government isn't even listening to what the CBI says in terms of what a 21st century education should look like, then we have a real, real problem.
I'm Ian Pace. I'm a performing musician, professional, and an academic here teaching musicology, but actually have a first degree in a STEM subject in maths, and worked extensively as a programmer and taught maths and physics at A-level and things like that. And well, the sort of maths I specialised in my degree, it was very, very pure maths. Things like logic, set theory, functional analysis, analytic topology, was more esoteric than anything I've ever encountered in the many arts worlds that I interact with, which tend to be on the esoteric wing of those. So that's one way in which often the claims of relevance don't sort of correspond with my own experience. But I'm a bit bothered by some of the things coming from this. I would have to say I hear, it's very effective referring to we on the panel, suggests a degree of consensus, which I would identify here as most panellists essentially taking what I'd see as a vaguely left liberal position, the one that Michael Gove would associate with the blob, as he calls it. And I know this is not for want of trying on Miguel's part. It would be good if we'd had someone whose viewpoint was closer to that to throw into the mix to debate with that, or even someone who thinks more along the Daily Mail lines. But one of the problems that comes out of things that I think there seems a bit of a consensus on here, one is to do with the term arts itself and the dualism presented between arts and sciences, which Nico certainly said things about. I want to know, where does that leave subjects such as foreign languages, philosophy, which is so rarely taught in the UK, unlike in France, and I think there's still an argument to be made that science is a branch of philosophy, or even history, and that one in particular. We have one letter here for the arts, but I'm not sure what those who study medieval art history or Japanese traditional theatrical practices or digital music technologies really have in common, that they can all be summed up by this term, the arts. But from that, I wanted to highlight something which came out of Deborah Annett's comments, which reminded me of those made recently in a talk by Simon Zagorski-Thomas, a professor at the University of West London, and also some points that have arisen in the previous two debates. Why do we have this relentless focus only on art, music, culture of today? Why is contemporary always seen as something to aspire to? And why, as such, is it so easy to have a pop at dead Germans and so on? Why are harmony and counterpoint less relevant than music technology? And when we use the language of creative industries, that loathsome term that comes from the New Labour era, have we not moved to a point where historical study of art has become deemed irrelevant? Which might echo the comments of the Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University Belfast, who said the other week that we didn't want to produce 21-year-old experts in 6th century history. I personally made a point of finding out some more about 6th century music as my own private form of defiance of that, and it's fascinating. But when we have a language that, what I think is a much worse term than arts for all that's problems, of creative industries, and of relevance, and the privileging of those more obviously applied and contemporary subjects, I wonder, are we not simply accepting the terms of reference of narrow-minded politicians who view learning primarily in terms of its economic benefits? And then what weapons do we have against the likes of Nicky Morgan, who pander to crude stereotypes? Pamela talks about playing into discourses, but I feel some of the views expressed here, including a manneristic dismissal of anything that might be called canonic, do exactly that. And just one tiny last point, after Nico's point about politicians today, I happen to know Tom Watson, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, quite a bit, and I can promise you he has a very deep interest in all sorts of indie popular bands, and more recently interest in Foray, after I was playing some of that to him. And Jeremy Corbyn actually paints abstract art at home as well. So I think it's wrong to think that having an artistic hinterland is something just for politicians of the past in some sort of golden age. But that's by the by. Interested in your thoughts on any of those points and questions.
I think the point you're making about the single letter A, I think that is the big risk of this sort of thing. Putting STEM together, that was done in America because it was a shorthand. It meant somebody didn't have to write however many words. So trying to stick an A in now, you're exacerbating the problem, because my point right at the beginning was, if we're looking for a genuine, well-rounded, broad-based curriculum, or education, not curriculum, education for children, then you've got to go for all of those things that you were saying. History's got to fit in, geography, economics, the whole raft. So you've got to look at that as a problem. I think that the other thing that you were referring to about the historical dimension, it sounds as though you have a similar problem to what I have with science. And when we made lots of changes to the science curriculum over sort of 10, 15 years ago, when it sort of came in and it was sort of much more about contemporary science, because that's what kids were interested in. I always saw that as a part of a problem, because actually teaching the contemporary stuff is not difficult, because it is exciting, going to the space and whatever, you can do that. How do you teach some of the core stuff in a way which kids can see as relevant to what's happening now? Now, first of all, you can get rid of the blast furnace, partly because we don't use them anymore. However, there are principles in science which, if you don't grasp, then the contemporary stuff means nothing. So it's actually how you get those really core basic principles of the subject in a way which kids can see how they link to what they do. And some of the math stuff about, you know, all our security systems on phones and things are based on mathematical algorithms. Get kids, how do they start? So I think I agree with you on that. It's a problem that we've got to address, and we've got to start respecting what's gone before, rather than just looking ahead that new is better. It isn't always. It might help. So I think, you know, those were the two sort of reactions I would have to what you're saying. And I think the thing about getting the views in there, yeah, we've got to have those views. Otherwise we just go round in circles, recycling our own pet theories rather than having them challenged.
Just picking up that point about the canon and music, because that's all I can really talk about. I'm absolutely all for 6th century music, but I think we need 21st century music as well. I think you need the whole lot to understand the journey. And I think our concern, particularly when the GCSEs were being formulated, was we were going to lose part of Bach and Stravinsky. And it seemed to be a very strange way of looking at music, that we were losing half of Bach and most of Stravinsky. You actually need much more than that. And that was a point that we made. It's the fullness and richness that we mustn't deny our children.
We only have a finite amount of time for teaching, even at university level. We can't do everything.
Absolutely, but I think to some extent there needs to be perhaps greater flexibility between the teacher and the student, so that you're actually being able to come up with the education which meets their needs and is as stimulating and inspiring as possible. And therefore you don't need a straitjacket coming down from government. I'm not sure you need that.
So, but actually, my interpretation of history over the national curriculum is that it's the subject disciplines or those communities that have actually created some of the problem for themselves. If I understand it correctly, when Margaret Thatcher asked for a national curriculum, she was really looking for a document which was about 4 or 5 pages long, which said children should have education and they should be exposed to them. That was it. Our friend Kenneth Baker came along and decided it ought to be bigger than that. And he invited experts, both from education and from the disciplines, to create the national curriculum. And the first national curriculum, you needed a shelf the width of this table to actually get the 17 or 18 documents that covered all of the subjects in the national curriculum. And they were all in ring binders, all different colours. You're smiling. You probably had them on your shelf, did you? Yeah, but that's where it started. And from then on, it was a battle to reduce the curriculum, so that all of a sudden there was no room for this negotiation. You know, that basically we wanted, whether it was science or whatever, an appreciation of certain aspects. And you could illustrate those with different things which you could have done within the negotiation at the local level. But that was removed. And then we've had this permanent battle. And once you've got documents that size, you've got to test them to make sure they know them. And then the testing goes down to every little bit. And that's when it starts. And then the design of the exams actually removes potential for demonstrating that I've thought more beyond this, because you end up with not necessarily multiple choice, but certainly structured answers where you had to do 2 sentences to say this, this and this.
Well, just briefly, I do know Tom Watson as well, and like him as I do, I can't compare him to Dennis Healy, but maybe he's got some growing to do. I think your point about 6th century music, I advocated knowledge for its own sake and the idea of disparate knowledge, and I think you can't predict where knowledge will take you, and you've got to leave things open. So I'm very much in favour of learning anything that, you know, it feels like a path you want to learn down. I will take up the question of creative industries. I think Deborah and I might disagree a bit here, because I think the creative industries is a construct of 3 different industries which don't have that much in common. One is the performing arts, essentially. The other is the creative industries that make things, which is animation, film, and so on, things which have value, the sort of reproducible value, and the other is design, essentially, which is everything from designing aircraft to clothing to houses and so on. And I think the attempt to conflate them has really confused thinking about economics and creative industries. And I'm going to come back on the dead white Germans as well, because actually I think...
shouldn't have said that, I really shouldn't.
I do believe in the canon, and I don't think it's exclusive to say that some of the best culture in our history was not created by people who represented their societies at the time or our societies. The Enlightenment, which many of these dead white Germans come out of, was a secular, and I don't mean that in a religious term, thing, which caught up people who had the intelligence, the wherewithal, and the ability to come up with transformative things. And if those people happened to be, well, they weren't dead at the time, German and white, so it was, but their culture they created is a universal culture, which is appreciated by people. Just for instance, C.L.R. James, some people might know of, one of the greatest intellectuals in the post-war period, who was a black Trinidadian, but he appreciated that the culture of his colonial masters was still a culture worth aspiring to, and one that he more than mastered. And just to quote Anish Kapoor on Front Row today, talking about Wagner, who's producing or designing set for Tristan and Isolde at the ENO, the art Wagner made is great enough not just to be tied to his psychobiography or his views, and Wagner is obviously one of the most controversial dead white Germans. So that's mine, and that is, I think, quite a controversial thing to say, given I'm a living white non-German male.
You mentioned changing the subject, but a lot of you mentioned things like bridges and collaboration, and yet we look at a siloed title where you're trying to put another silo in it. And I just wondered your views that actually it's the responsibility of the teacher or the local community, where the school, to try and maybe teach these things in a cross-discipline manner. I'm not sure whether that's possible. I'm not a teacher in a secondary school. So whether it's actually the responsibility of the teachers or the teaching profession to make, irrespective of what the silos are, to make them integrated and relevant to today's students.
Thank you. Can I just respond? I applaud your introduction of the word interdisciplinary, and I think you're also getting at the idea of a changing conception of what education needs to be. The canon is incredibly gendered, it's white, it's Western, and the changing conception of education in terms of reflecting society and our changing societies, rapidly changing face of who's in the classroom, who's teaching the classroom, where is the classroom, whose voices are being heard. I would have loved to have seen a table over here with a panel of young people, and I'm talking about young people in primary, secondary, further education and higher education, and communities being represented. We're not representative of our society here at this moment. I think bridges is a fantastic metaphor for where we need to be bridging, from historical perspectives and hegemonic perspectives that need to be opened up to be thinking around equalities, inequalities. The canon needs to be questioned. We need to question our own assumptions, our own taken for granted assumptions. And I come back to the discourse, the language that we continue to kind of perpetuate, and the idea of knowledge. Knowledges represents, I think, more the pluralist view of what's out there, knowing, ways of knowing, indigenous ways of knowing. Curricula is what, ways of knowing that change the way we value place, family, space, the nature, and the nature of science. So, what view of science are you all sharing? Do you share the definition of science as someone said it related to philosophy. It does originate from philosophy, but there are other cultures that have very different views on science and its relationship to nature and the integration of the arts. So I think we need to question what is the changing conceptualization of knowledges in relation to education that reflects and enables equalities in today's societies, that does draw from the past, a usable past, and remembering it doesn't all happen in classrooms. We want to engage students so that we actually commit students to inquiry, curiosity, imagination, being committed, being engaged and not wanting to leave the classroom and truant through their school days.
On that canon view, I mean, that's the view I've heard, read hundreds, maybe thousands of times from half the academics in this country on the canon.
Yep.
Now,
doesn't make it right.
No, it doesn't. Just because it doesn't make it right. No, it's that view. And I think that's the discourse, the mannered discourse, yes, which carries a certain amount of capital in academic circles to, yes, do a bit of routine canon bashing. I teach historical music. I have a limited amount of time in which I can teach whatever sub-area I'm doing there, so I have to make some choices. I'll teach some things and not some others, and I try to choose it in such a way that I hope there's some sort of coherence there. In that process, I'm doing basically what I think most people are doing when they're teaching a canon. They're just realizing that you can't just teach absolutely everything, you need to make some choices, yes, and it's better to... and those things are always being rethought, renegotiated, and it doesn't have to be in just a Western canon either. It depends what subject you're teaching. It's just, people just bash the canon with no real serious alternative put in place other than usually the abandonment of historical study altogether.
So can I come back to your question, just before you go? Just to say, just to say, in many respects, you're right, because we still haven't got to that point where there is an inspector in your classroom insisting you do it by this book. So there is flexibility for teachers. The question is whether they can take advantage of that, and they have got the mindset to do it. And ironically, there is actually a potential for this, using the government's own policies, if schools are prepared to stand up and do it. Because if you become an academy, you do not have to follow the national curriculum. You can devise your own curriculum. It still has to be broad, balanced, and all of that. Yeah. So there is potential.
You made a point about communities. I'm a lecturer at Brunel, and one of my students doing a master's dissertation asked schools what they want from brands, assuming they would want to branded rulers and iPhones and computers. Well, the general answer that came back from teachers, these were secondary schools, was, we'd love knowledge, please. Can you just come in and tell us what you're doing now? Mr. IBM, Mr. BT, and it could be the local musician or artist. And I sometimes think we build barriers around schools, and we should, and that's not totally true, is it, of course, but I think we should be breaking down those.
Yeah, and there are some examples of very good practice out there, actually.
I'm sure, yeah, but it's not general, is it?
No, that's the problem. Get it system-wide.
And we're all very comfortable here in London, no problem. But if you go somewhere else, in Cornwall or Scotland, maybe it's not. No northern bashing here.
I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. So perhaps you join me in thanking our panellists, but just to say before we do that I'm sure those of you who want to continue this discussion, we will be down in the local pub, the Peasant, which is just on your left as you come out of the college building, about 5 minutes. Hopefully we'll see some of you there. Thank you to all our panellists for a thought-provoking discussion.